Let's say you just bought a house. Bad news is, you're one step closer to becoming your parents. You'll proudly mow the lawn, ask if anybody noticed you mowed the lawn, tell people to stay off the lawn, compare it to your neighbor's lawn, and complain about having to mow the lawn again. Good news is, it's easy to bundle home and auto through Progressive and save on your car insurance, which, of course, will go right into the lawn. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and infertility. Today we're going to be talking about navigating the teen years as an adoptive parent. I think you are going to love this show. I know that I did. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
Because of the deprivation that so many adoptees have suffered through, I think that maybe unconsciously or maybe without even being aware of it, that adoptive parents equate saying no with deprivation.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the director of Creating a Family. We are the National Adoption and Infertility Education and Support nonprofit, and you can find us online at creatingafamily.org. One of the things we do at Creating a Family is we have online education for adoptive parents as well as social workers. But one of the courses that we have in our Adopt Ed for Parents is, that I think you'll find relevant to today's show. Actually, I'm going to give you two of them. One is Adoption in the Age of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the Internet. And the other one is a course on talking with tweens and teens about adoption. Both feel relevant to the topic of today's show, which is Navigating the Teen Years, or an Adoptive Parent's Guide to Navigating the Teen Years. I think you're really going to enjoy those courses. I think they're relevant and very helpful for you as a parent. You can find them by going to our website, creatingafamily.org, hover over online courses, and click on Adoptive Parents, and it will take you right there, and you can find it. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. Ferring recently launched their My Fertility Navigator program, which offers free one-on-one support for women who are struggling to get pregnant and are unsure of where or how to begin their infertility journey. Once enrolled in My Fertility Navigator, women will receive a personalized guidance from a live dedicated fertility navigator who will help provide important information about fertility, including how to find a fertility center, information about financial resources, and discuss the many fertility treatment options that are available. You can get more information about My Fertility Navigator at their website, which is myfertilitynav.com/NIAW, NIAW at the end, myfertilitynav.com/NIAW. This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not happen without the generous support from our gold sponsors who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those struggling to create a family. Some of our wonderful gold sponsors include Children's House International. They are a nonprofit, Hague-accredited international adoption agency with programs in 13 countries. They provide full services, including home studies in the states of Florida, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Texas, Utah, and Washington State, and they provide children with any U.S.-approved family worldwide. We also have MLJ Adoptions. They are a nonprofit, Hague-accredited adoption agency serving families across the United States who are interested in growing their families through international adoption. They also offer home study services to residents of Indiana. And Vista Del Mar. They are a licensed and accredited nonprofit adoption agency with over 65 years of experience helping to create families. They have 3 adoption programs, a private infant adoption program, an international program, as well as a adopting through foster care program. In addition to those gold sponsors, we also have other sponsors whose generosity allows us to bring you this show. We ask that when choosing an adoption service provider, please consider choosing one from the Creating a Family directories, which you can find on the service provider page of our website. You can search by location, services provided, number of years in operation, just a host of factors that we think are important when choosing. And by using these directories, you support those who support us, and we thank you. Today's interview is with Katie Naftzger. She is a psychotherapist outside of Boston that specializes in adoption, and she is also a transracial adoptee who is adopted from Korea. Welcome, Katie, to Creating a Family.
Thank you so much.
Today we're going to be talking about an adoptive parent's guide to navigating the teen years. And Katie, it's based on a book that you wrote, Parenting in the Eye of the Storm, The Adoptive Parent's Guide to Navigating the Teen Years. I've got to tell you, I really, really love this book. It was both practical, it was empathetic, it was heartfelt. And this is coming from me, and I have experienced parenting 4 teens. In fact, I am now officially no longer the parent of a teen, since my youngest has just turned out of the teen years. So I know of what I speak about the teen years, and so I truly enjoyed this book and thought it was a real asset to the adoptive parent library of books, and one that I think parents should add to their own personal library. I wanted to start, at the beginning of the book, you gave an analogy that really struck me. It was about you were trying to help us as adoptive parents understand in some ways what it feels like to be an adopted person. And you used the analogy to coming in just slightly late to a movie theater. Can you tell us that for everybody now listening?
So, yes, the way I began the book was to talk about the experience of walking into a movie 20 minutes late and having the movie have already started, and just that experience of not knowing what happened in the movie and being aware that everyone else has already been there from the beginning, and trying to figure out how to navigate that as an adoptee. And I think what was important for me was also to talk about the experiences that are wordless, and that is one of the many experiences that I discuss in the book that doesn't often get put to words in real life. That's something that's an internal experience for adoptees and hard to describe, which is also why I think I probably end up using a lot of metaphor.
Yeah, and I like that. You did use a lot of metaphor, and I particularly appreciated that. And the thing that struck me about that analogy, that metaphor, and I think it was addressing some of the many losses inherently embedded in adoption, and that was the loss of continuity. And what struck me, and honestly, I didn't remember that the analogy only said 20 minutes late, because in my mind, it was important that you didn't have to be very late, that it was only, you just had to be a little late, and you're still wondering in that, what happened at the very beginning? Did something, as the movie progresses and you don't quite get something, you kind of think back, if I had been there for the first 5 minutes, 10 minutes, would I understand this piece? And that really struck me, because it's one thing if you come in halfway through a movie, then of course you don't expect to get it. But the rest of the world would assume that as an adopted person, that if you were adopted at a very young age, that there wouldn't be any of this lack of continuity. But in fact, there is, or at least that's how I interpreted your analogy there.
I think you're right, and I think the rest of the world also tends to think of 5 minutes as 5 minutes. And, so that was also part of the metaphor, of having other people sort of try to reassure the person of, you didn't miss much, or,
Exactly.
Nothing important happened, or, this, that, and the other, and having that gulf of empathy or lack of empathy there, too.
Yes, exactly. And trying to downplay it. Oh, no big deal. I mean, gosh, you just, basically just missed the very first part. Not a big deal. When, in fact, it does color how you view the rest of the movie, and it does color from an adopted person's standpoint how they view their life. Another quote from your book that I liked was, "Being adopted is not just an isolated event. It's part of one's identity that is constantly evolving and changing." And I wanted to ask about that, particularly in the teen years, the part where you talk about both of them, both it's being, as part of one's identity and the fact that it's constantly evolving. So how does adoption play into the identity of an adopted person? And let's talk about both children who were adopted at a young age, as well, obviously, as children who are adopted at an older age. And I think it's clearer to us. The answer is far clearer when we think of a child who's been adopted as a school-age child, or even as a tweener or a teen themselves. It seems more obvious. But what about as a person who was adopted either as an infant or as a toddler or preschooler or something at a young age?
Well, there's a quote in the book that a teenager told me, which was, how can you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been? And
yeah.
I think that includes a lot in it, and I think it kind of speaks to the adoption identity piece, that it's not just something that happens to you, it's something that you continue to wrestle with, and that it means different things at different points in your life, and that for him, what he was speaking to and what I speak to later in the book, which we may get to, about envisioning the future, is that it's difficult to know your future or to have a sense of feeling empowered about your future if you don't really know where you came from.
Yeah. Actually, let's jump into that too. Okay, you talk about that parents need to develop 4 skills to help their kids through their teen years. And in particular, you're speaking of adoptive parents and adopted teens. And I'm going to read off the 4 skills, and then we're going to talk about all 4 of them. The first one is learning to unrescue your child. The next one is setting adoption-sensitive limits. The third one is having connected or empathetic conversations. And the fourth one is helping your teen envision their future. That's the one you just mentioned. All right, let's talk about, I was particularly interested in the first one, not rescuing your kid. I think that is a fascinating one. I think that it's a very, I think in particular right now it's an interesting one because the rage is attachment parenting. We talk about it. We have a large Facebook support group, and it is 15 times a day somebody is talking about some aspect of attachment parenting. And it occurs to me as I was reading the section that there's a fine line, it seems like, between what we're calling attachment parenting, and quite frankly, some of attachment parenting looks a whole lot like helicopter parenting, and something that adoptive parents seem to, all parents, quite frankly, but particularly adoptive parents, in their desire to create attachment and security when their children are younger, are maybe having a hard time understanding the distinctions of how to shift when their children are teens. Are you seeing that as well in your practice?
I am, and you talk about attachment parenting, and I also think of just in terms of development of children that the latency age, which is sort of more of the elementary school age, is also more about stability and information and a positive relationship with your parent, whether it's adoptive parent or just a non-adoptive parent, and that everything sort of totally changes once the teen years come into play, and it's actually almost can feel like the opposite, where hence the storm of feeling like it's unstable, there's no continuity, you never know what is going to happen the next day, and that how can parents change and adjust their parenting from working on the attachment to working on preparing them for the future, and preparing and also helping them stay connected with you over the long haul, but not necessarily in that particular moment that they're in with them.
Oh, I like that, because you're right. We do worry, and perhaps as adoptive parents, we worry more about wanting to make certain that. I heard a parent say one time, and it was so. It just struck a chord with me. She talked about as her child was leaving for college, and she said, I hope that the bond is strong enough that he will come back. That she wants him. She was aware that he needed to launch, but she wanted to know, and by come back, she did not mean physically come back, but that be emotionally still connected as an adult. And I do think adoptive parents worry about that. And I think it influences oftentimes how they parent in their teen years.
Sure. The teen years are such a high-risk time, too, and so there are valid and understandable reasons why parents would have a lot of fear about a lot of things, whether it's losing the connection or whether it's just fear of their safety. And, again, that's what the teen years are all about, that some of that stuff gets questioned and tested with, like, safety and whether it's emotional health or physical health. And so there is a dynamic that tends to play out, which really can backfire in the teen years, where parents, adoptive parents, let's say, find themselves intervening in times when, the teens really need to learn through life. And, if we take ourselves out of the parent role for a second and think about our own childhoods and our own teenhoods, I think if we were to think back, most of the times that were the highest learning times for us were also the times when we struggled the most and may have even felt abandoned a little bit. And what I emphasize in the book is that feeling abandoned is different than being abandoned. That you can still help your child feel empowered or your teen feel empowered and not abandon them.
Mm-hmm. And not rescue them. That it's not the opposite of taking care of is not abandoning. You don't that by allowing life. I often have said through my children's teen years that my best role is to step back and let life teach them, because they're going to learn more from life than me trying to teach them. But the transition of not wanting our children to fail, that when our children are even in their latter elementary ages, I think we as parents often are wanting to step in because we don't want them to fail. And how much of that is tied up into our own needs and not our kids' needs?
I think it can get a little confusing. And if we think back to the adoption narrative, where although adoptive parents weren't technically the rescuers, they were the ones who picked up where the birth or biological parents left off. And so there is kind of an internal contract, I think, for adoptive parents within themselves, that they will always be there and that they will never kind of do the same things that were already done to their teens. And I think that can sort of sometimes cloud the better judgment of adoptive parents. I mean, when I talk to adoptive parents, often they do know that they're doing it. They describe themselves as rescuing their teen all the time and just have trouble kind of getting out of that dynamic.
Right, because but what does that do to a young person who being rescued? What does being rescued do to a teen, a young person who is in the position of being the rescued person?
Yeah, well, I think it can sort of reinforce the question that adopted teens have, whether it's conscious or unconscious: do I need to be rescued? I know that adoptees sometimes have a negative reaction to the idea of being rescued, but I think that's about something a little bit different. I mean, the truth is there was intervention that was needed in order for them to have the family that they deserve. And, I think that part of the story can really impact and sort of mess with the identity of adopted teens. And so they find themselves wondering, am I someone who needs to be rescued or not? The message that we send them is, these things happened to you. They weren't your fault, and there was nothing that you could have done. And that message doesn't work that well in the teen years, because really the message in the teen years needs to be, it may not have been your fault, but it's now your responsibility to take active, empowered steps in your own life.
Right. And, one of the things that occurred to me, you didn't talk about it in the book, because the book is really directed towards teen years, but it's not the moment that your child turns 13 with a teen after their age that we need to start thinking about these things, which is one of the reasons that I feel like this book would be particularly helpful for people to read, not just in their child's teen years, but also in their latter elementary school years, their tween years, and even slightly before, because I think that the philosophy that you're talking about actually would be better to be started slightly younger, so that it's not an abrupt shift immediately when on your child's 13th birthday.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I, actually a lot of parents that have talked to me about the book and who are reading the book are parents of younger kids, and I think they want to be proactive and to start really making that shift over time. It's hard to change. It's hard to change your behavior as a parent, and especially during a time that is so tumultuous anyway. And so it is nice. It's not necessary, but it is nice to be able to read it when the kids are a little younger.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the things that I throughout the book, it occurred to me when I was, and one of the things you did that I enjoyed, you gave real life examples throughout the book, which just makes it a more interesting read. And one of the things that was interesting is, as I'm reading these examples, that often it's hard to distinguish our need as a parent from our child's needs, our need as a parent to make our child feel better versus what our child really needs at that moment. So we do all we can to assuage their fears or their concerns because we need them to feel better. And what they really need is for us just to listen and hear their fear or their pain and not immediately try to make it all better. And there was a really poignant time you talked about, example you gave of a 13-year-old who had been internationally adopted, and she had been left outside of a child welfare institution. And you didn't say for how long or whatever, but she was old enough at that age to realize, and she was so upset by realizing that I could have died. And as a parent, of course, my immediate thought was, oh, but chances are good you were left there in a time when you wouldn't have. There was some conscious thought. That would have been what, of course, I would want to say. But you encouraged just to listen. And what you responded was, that must have been an awful feeling.
Yes, and the other part of the example was that was the one thing she hadn't shared with her mother, her adoptive mother, and they had and have a very positive relationship, but it intrigued me that was the one thing she hadn't shared, and I think it is because she suspected that her mother would not be able to cope with it, that it would just be too much for her, And yeah, I think a lot of parents respond that way. That oh no, sweetie, look, kids get taken care of. Someone loved you and they made sure that But in fact, that can actually make the adoptee feel more guilty, more misunderstood, and then more protective of you as the adoptive parent because they are sensing that they feel like the parent can't handle the truth.
Yeah. And I think that plays into why we often rescue our children, too, is that we don't want our kids to be in pain. We don't want our kids to, as I said before, face failure. We don't want them to fail their class. We don't want them to get arrested. We don't want them to do any number of things that, and so it is our, but in some ways our rescuing is to make us feel better and, quite frankly, probably to make us look better in the eyes of the world, too.
Yeah, well, right. No, I think that's really true. I think about those turtles because the way I talked about the unrescuing was those baby sea turtles that go across the beach into the water, and that some people tend to pick up the turtles and bring them by hand to the water, and I think the reason for that is because they want to make sure that they get to the water. But in fact, what ends up happening is that they compromise the turtle because the turtle now doesn't have the strength to survive as well as they would otherwise. They need that walk in order to have their best chance. And I think that there is a way that, adoptive parents sometimes end up picking up their kids. And I think in part it's because they've already been through so much. When the kids came, they've already been through sort of hell and back, kind of thing. And so
exactly.
So it's just, you're already feeling like you couldn't protect them through that. And so you want to do your part now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They've already had a hard life, therefore it's my job to make their life easy now. That's my job as a parent. Yeah. If that's not our job as parents, though, then what is our job?
And so then we come back to the unrescuing, that really our goal is to help them feel prepared and confident heading into the future. I mean, the tragedy for me, and this was maybe in a way one of the the inspirations for the book was that parents were not that young adults I saw were not prepared for the future, and it was in part because they were so protected and they were so reassured, and then they were sort of thrust into young adulthood, whether they left home or not, and then they're not prepared, and then it can almost feel like another sort of form of abandonment, even though that's the opposite of what the adoptive parent was going for, and so that was, I think, something that was really painful for me, and something that I really was driven to try to address. And I think so many adoptive parents, I would say, let's say most adoptive parents, are doing everything they possibly can. And I think it's a matter of a mindset shift to think ahead as opposed to, thinking about the past and protecting and all of that stuff.
And knowing that our real role is to prepare our children for adulthood, to live away from us, to individuate from us, to move, to go out in the world where they don't need us, which is actually quite, the parental obsolescence is really hard as a parent to accept. But it is what I believe our role is. Doesn't make me always like it, I might add.
Absolutely, and you mentioned the insecurity, I think, for adoptive parents that once they leave, they might not come back, and so there can be sort of again, whether it's conscious or not, sort of a clinging, a clinging that happens, and that can be just a little bit stressful for the teen.
Sure, it puts it's an unfair burden. It seems to me it would put an unfair burden on a teen whose job is to move out into the world and tackle it, and to have the confidence to do it, and to know that when they screw up, that they can dust themselves off and get back up. That's what we want. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and so much of the book has to do with coping. The language that we're using, the things that we're having, the life events and the way that life shapes who we are and responsibilities, that we're really learning to cope with adversity, that it's not just about removing those feelings of feeling abandoned, and clearly we can't remove the past. And so, we're really trying to help them cope with adversity because we know that it will happen.
Yeah,
and probably
absolutely.
When we're not there.
Absolutely. It's part of it. We won't always be there, nor should we be. But and I think I wonder, too, how much of this is not all adoptive parents, but many, come to adoption from infertility and having long struggled to become a parent and are highly vested in being a parent. Thus, the idea of ultimately working yourself out of a job that you've coveted for a long time and probably are enjoying is a bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah, and I think about, you and I just mentioned the thing about that the adoptees have been through so much, but I think you're also talking about, that adoptive parents have already been through so much, that so many did come through the road of infertility, and that does, I think that can add a heightened sensitivity to when things aren't going well, or when it feels like things aren't going well.
Yes, I think
I can remember there was a story. One of the things that can sometimes happen is that in the throes of separation, let's say senior year of high school, is that some adoptees never speak to their parents or don't say a lot to their parents, but those who do tend to pull back and they don't say as much to them. And the way they frame it is confusing for the adoptive parent, because they'll sort of say it in an angry way. Like, I don't tell you anything anymore. You don't know about my life at all. And so it does make it sound like the adoptive parent is at fault. And what will happen is that the adoptive parent will come in to me and say that I think I failed as a parent because my daughter can't talk to me anymore, and I've spent all these years trying to help her feel comfortable opening up to me, and now she says that she can't do it. And in fact, she is grappling with her own feelings of separation, and that it's more grieving. It's not so much that it should be different.
Absolutely. We're talking today with Katie Naftzger. She is a psychotherapist specializing in adoption and an adult adoptee who was adopted from Korea. The title of her book is Parenting in the Eye of the Storm, The Adoptive Parent's Guide to Navigating the Teen Years. You are listening to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and infertility. We primarily keep in touch with our community through our weekly e-newsletter. We have two of them, one for adoption and one for infertility, so you can choose which one or both. We let you know about the latest developments in adoption and or infertility, as well as upcoming week's blog topics and show topics and things such as that. You can receive our newsletter, our weekly newsletter, by signing up for it on any page of our website, creatingafamily.org, in the top right corner. One of the things that happens in adolescence is sexual maturity. Our bodies change. We become sexual beings. And how is this, our maturing bodies, how is this threatening and scary to some adopted teens? How does adoption play into that? I mean, there's obviously issues we all have, having come to terms with our changing bodies. But how, in specific, might this be different for an adopted teen?
I think it is pretty evocative, and of course that's true that we always have that question in our mind, is this adoption or is this teenhood or is this something else entirely? And the way that has been helpful for me to think about it is, what is the intersection between adoption and teenhood? And so, in a sense, we're looking more for the ways that both of those overlap each other, not so much which is the one and which is the other thing, because of course there is so much overlap. But one of the pieces about the adoptee is that during the teen years is that it deepens the complexity of the birth parent story. That once they hit puberty, once they start dating or even start thinking about the future or even start fantasizing about having biological kids or adopting kids or having any kind of family of their own, whatever that might look like, it changes the way they think about their birth parent, that they can now identify with their birth parent in a way that they couldn't before. Before it was different. In the latency years, it was more about facts, maybe feelings like they missed them and wanted to find them, or maybe, anger and various things. But it wasn't so much that they identified with them. And now, as a teen, they can put themselves in the position of the birth parent, and that's extremely evocative. And it really spans all of the teen kind of developmental dimensions of teenhood, right? Because cognitively, too, as we know, that teens often go from more concrete to abstract thinking. So they're more kind of interested in the gray area. And so that also changes the story, because now they're not just asking, why did you give me up? They want to know the nuances. They want to know what happened. They want to know their personal story, not just the story that everyone gets.
You made an interesting point, too, about having a baby is a way to have a biological connection. And for some adoptees, it may be the first time they've ever had a biological connection to someone. And it's a way to more closely identify with the birth parents, or even a way to have a different ending to a situation. So it makes me wonder, and you may not know the answer to this question, is the pregnancy rate higher for adopted teens than non-adopted teens?
Ooh, that is a good question. I'm interested in looking into that. But I think you're right that that adoptees, there is a longing to close that gap. Kind of that there was that 20 minutes or 5 minutes, before the and that they just want to close the gap. And so I think that's true. And then also just to speak about the morality of the birth parent situation for adopted teens, that, as they move into teenhood, they are also thinking their morals are developing and what's right and what's wrong, and thinking in more depth about that. And so they are also looking at the birth parent situation or the biological parent situation with more questions about how could she do this, and how could this happen, and is this, what is my moral stance on this, too?
Yeah. And how could somebody make this decision? And do you see a difference in your practice or in the research that you've read between kids who are teens who are in an open adoptive relationship, so have some information of or even contact with their birth family, versus those in a closed adoption?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting because those who are in a closed adoption or those, let's say, who are internationally adopted and never knew their birth parent and may never know even the identity of their birth parent, let alone meet them, there is some jealousy of the open adoption, and I would suggest that, those who have an open adoption, in a way might look at international adoptees as maybe a little simpler because you don't have that ongoing relationship to contend with, and that, if you choose to search, that's sort of in your arena as a choice. But yeah, I think there's a lot more anguish in terms of the abandonment piece for open adoption, that, when for international adoptees, when the birth mother does not come to search, it means something different than when your, birth mom is in the next neighborhood over and you see them in the news and you know that they're around and you know that they're choosing not to have contact with you. So I think it's much more in reality, and in that way, in a sense, it's easier, but in a sense, it makes it a lot harder.
What about in cases where you do have contact with your birth mother and birth father, where the teen knows them as a person, may even see them a couple of times a year? Does that we tell everyone that one of the advantages of open adoption is it allows for your child and your adolescent to have less questions. Do you see that actually playing out?
Yeah, I think there is some peace of mind in knowing that you have some sort of control in the relationship, and that you have kind of a live, ongoing role in the relationship. So, and just certainly, I completely support open adoption. So that's definitely my bias about that.
Well, and I think sometimes the reality is, as our children move into their teenhood and start having more nuanced questions and start seeing more of the gray, that they can ask somebody. They can call up their birth mom and say, well, but other 20-year-olds were able to keep their child. Why weren't you able to keep me? As opposed to just wondering it. There's actually a person that can answer that question.
There is. I mean, the conversations that happen are sometimes not, that there's a lot left unsaid. But
yes,
but absolutely. And I think, not to generalize, but, often adopted boys or adopted teens who are boys do sort of challenge their father, their birth father, in their mind about what might have happened to lead to the situation. And, it's not uncommon for there to have been some form of violence or abuse, if not directly relating to the child, then also just maybe just in their life. And it's interesting. They're in each other's presence, but sometimes it's still challenging to find ways to speak about it.
That's a good point, because the scenario that I painted, which is a child calling up and saying, well, not just a personal question, but really a challenging question to a birth parent about, why couldn't you do it when other people can, is not an easy conversation to have. And although it is possible, I think your point's well taken, that possible is one thing, but whether that would happen, particularly in the teen years, and whether both the teen or the birth parent would be open to that conversation is a whole other issue. Yeah.
And because it's so sensitive, I guess in my experience they haven't been that. It hasn't gone well, those conversations, and that there's a lot of defensiveness, and sometimes there's a little bit of lashing back on the part of the birth parent, and so I think as an adoptive parent, that's how we would like to think that we would respond. If we were in that situation, and yet of course the role is so different.
Well, and the truth is, any of us, if we're being challenged, tends to react if we're not very careful and from a defensive posture. So, yeah. So the key, would, of course, would be hopefully that that we could coach our teens before that conversation to help them think through how to ask it in a way that will not elicit defensiveness. You state that every issue with your adopted teen is a family issue, and I really thought about that. And that was in the section of the book where you're talking about the tremendous impact that parents have on their teens. But I got to tell you, most parents of teens do not think they have so much impact.
Yes, I know. That's what's fascinating, right?
It is fascinating.
So much of this book came from my work experience with adopted teens that I just have seen so many of them and had so many conversations, and that was one of the striking pieces, is that they're very, very impacted by their adoptive parents, and as I said in the book, more than anyone else in their life, I would say. And I think when, sometimes, as you're mentioning, adoptive parents don't realize that.
Yeah, because our teens are telling us generally telling us and showing us that our wisdom, our pearls of wisdom, are really just not as not only impactful, but really are not welcome. It was interesting to me how often, though, you talked about that the teens truly did care about what their parents thought, and it really mattered to them.
They care a lot about what their parents think, not necessarily about the pearls of wisdom, in terms of like the the advice. They don't necessarily pair it to me, but they do. They are very affected by any tension in the relationship, and they're very, very upset when it's not going well, which is also fascinating because, again, you don't see that. As you're describing, you don't see that so much at home. But as I mentioned in the book, oftentimes the sort of most emotional moments in session are about when they're talking about their parents. Yeah.
And we see that in our support group when adoptees talk about their parents. They're about. It's very true. It's the most emotional, and it's, of course, we're talking with adults generally in the support group, not. I wanted to talk to you about, and I thought this was an interesting, you talk about bringing up adoption in the teen years. And what struck a chord with me is that, I have certainly in our educational material with when we're talking about adoption with younger children, we specifically say that just because your child is not talking about adoption does not mean that they don't have questions, because a lot of parents take the attitude of, I'll talk about adoption if the kid brings it up, but if the kid doesn't bring it up, I'm not going to talk about adoption because that's me, shoving it down their throat or whatever, or more likely because I'm uncomfortable with it anyway and don't want to talk about it. But you talk about how that's not necessarily the best approach in the teen years. So if your teenager is not bringing up adoption, is it, as a parent, is it our responsibility to occasionally bring it up just so that they know it's a topic that we're still open to talk about?
You can occasionally bring it up. I think in my experience, the reasons that they're not bringing it up are not related to that. They're not coming into session and saying, well, my mom doesn't feel comfortable talking about it, so I'm not going to bring it up. They're not bringing it up for other reasons, and I think in part because they're exploring their identity, and they don't want to just be, let's say, Stephen. They don't want to be just an adoptee whose name is Stephen. They want to be Stephen who happens to be an adoptee, and so they don't always want that to be at the top of the list. And I think the other piece about that, and with the whole bringing it up thing, is that what I was finding was that adoptive parents were bringing it up as a way to attempt to connect with their adopted teen when things weren't going well, as a sort of bridge, and that wasn't really working. And what I mentioned in the book is that respect comes before a connection. And that if the teen does not respect their parents, then it's really not even fair to try to ask them about kind of deep personal topics, because that has to be, you have to get to that organically, I think, especially during the teen years.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point. It's a way of it could be brought up if you're not thinking about it carefully. You may bring it up as a way to try to connect on an emotional level with your teen. And one of your suggestions, which I thought was a great one, was one way to bring it up is to not ask how they're feeling about it, but to describe your feelings. I think it was that section of the book where you talked about, and it was funny because I had this exact conversation with one of my teens, and it was on after a birthday, and I said, I always think about your birth mom on your birthday, and I didn't then say didn't put the pressure on them to see if they did as well. And I will say that that particular child, didn't. I always talk about it as throwing the ball out and see if they want, but giving them the option of catching it, and that ball fell very flat. Did not want to catch it at all. Okay, glad you're thinking about it, Mom.
Yeah.
Which is okay.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons for that too. One is not to put the pressure on, and then the other is to try to guard against projection. That teens are relieved when they know that we as parents or caretakers or what have you, therapists, are owning our own experience and not kind of projecting our experience. There's that other example in the book where, that mom talks about worrying that her daughter will feel abandoned when she goes off to college. And in truth, it was really the mom who was concerned about feeling abandoned when her daughter was off to college. And so there's a lot of relief when parents own their own experience, because it is different. It often is very different than the adopted teen experience. And so teens are really looking for that. And that really leads to a little bit more respect, a little bit more trust.
Absolutely. So you talked about the 4 skills that adoptive parents need to develop to help their kids through their teen years, and I would say also to launch them into adulthood. And the first one we've talked about some is not rescuing their child. The second one is setting adoption-sensitive limits. Do you think adoptive parents in particular have more trouble in setting limits than non-adoptive parents?
I do think so, and of course it's a general feeling. But I think that because of the deprivation that so many adoptees have suffered through, I think that maybe unconsciously or maybe without even being aware of it, that adoptive parents equate saying no with deprivation, and so it makes it harder for us to set a boundary, like no, the kitchen is closed after 9 p.m. or just very. There are various examples, but
Sure.
And so I do think it's especially difficult, and often parents will say things like, "Look, they've been through so much already," or "I couldn't take that away from them," I think it's extra laden for them.
But just as important. And what do you mean by adoption-sensitive limits?
So there are certain dynamics in the adoption piece which I think are really important. One of the issues that comes up a lot is negotiating, and certainly there's a lot of talk about the pros and cons of negotiating in general. It's not just an adoption issue, clearly, but for adoptees, it does trigger certain feelings that I think are best not triggered that way if possible, where adoptees were sort of left to be dependent on the kindness of strangers and not just having it go the usual way of starting a family and having that same family. And so when they start negotiating with the parent, first of all, they have less respect for the parent if the parent is allowing this to go on. But also there can be kind of a begging, an experience for adoptees as if they're sort of begging. They feel like they're begging for something that they should be entitled to or may be entitled to, and the begging can really kind of lead to some rage that is not necessarily directly expressed.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that that we talk about this with younger children about throwing out the "you're not my real mother" card, and that's used as a way of diverting parents from setting a limit. And that could happen, of course, in the teen years, but there's also other things. Teens are also sharp enough and wise enough and nuanced enough to be able to try to divert parents from setting limits by introducing adoption-related topics. So how would you handle that? if your kid throws out and tries to muddle while you're trying to set limits, tries to introduce the adoption topic.
And this is also such a big challenge because the adoption conversation and the setting limits conversation should not mix, because when it mixes, it dilutes both. So when your teen brings up something about, well, you never cared about me anyway, or why don't you trust me, or something that is sort of personally hurt, suggesting that he or she is personally hurt, or maybe you shouldn't have even adopted me, or something. And and this is really challenging for parents, but this is really better for the teen. Is that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about your curfew. And it really protects. It not only helps you with your authority, but it also protects the adoption conversation, because once you have that adoption piece muddled in, it sends a lot of different messages. It sends a message to the teen that they can use the adoption card, not just with you, but with other things in their life. When things aren't going well, look, I'm adopted, so I can't do this job, or, I just, and it ends up being kind of a crutch, which, again, we do not want, because that thwarts feeling empowered and responsible.
Yeah, and I love the concept that as parents, our job is to empower our kids, that we want to create empowered human beings, adults. And I love that concept, because I think that just that word empowered is such a, to be redundant, powerful, but it is. All right, so another one of the topics that you say that the skills that we as adoptive parents need to develop to help our adopted teens is we need to learn how to have connected, empathetic conversations with our kids. What do you mean by an empathetic conversation or connected conversation, either one?
The connecting conversation is one where the teen and the adult in the conversation, let's say the adoptive parent, both feel better at the end of the conversation, which is actually pretty challenging to do with teens. And that it's just common for adoptive parents to start a conversation, feel that it's going pretty well, and then suddenly it falls apart, and they don't really understand why. And those are the conversations that I often experience in my office too, where it starts a certain way, and the parent has certain hopes about connecting or getting a certain point across, and then it just falls apart, and everyone in the conversation feels worse, and then they end up feeling a little bit more concerned about having more conversations about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you also get, then your frustration kicks in, and you feel defeated. As a parent, I'm speaking, and I'm sure as a teen as well, that they feel the same, and that's not what we're. So what are some things that we as parents can think about in order to have empathetic conversations? And then I'm going to talk about some of the minefields, because there's two in particular that just made me smile because I've been guilty of them.
So I think the big challenge for adoptive parents is to access your vulnerability, your feelings of vulnerability in the conversation, not to talk about it, not to talk about how your experience is similar, or but just to kind of recall a time when you felt equally vulnerable, and to try to get into that feeling a little bit. And, I think that's one of the pieces of my being an adoptee, that I can access that vulnerability quickly in working with, adopted teens. And so it's not that I understand them better than their parents. Usually I don't. But it is right there. And once you're able to access your vulnerability, and not the kind of vulnerability that we find ourselves using as parents, I think that sometimes when we think we're heading toward vulnerability, actually we're still choosing a story that we feel pretty good about. That we're not really going for the deep humiliation of, something that was just, and so, we choose the protected parent story of vulnerability, but when we can really get maybe just one or two levels deeper, like that example I used in the book about the the father and son, and the father talked about his reason for adopting was because his father died. And that really served as a connection for the son, who was totally disengaged before that. So when you're able to access authentic, unprotected vulnerability in a manageable way, the whole way you talk to your teen changes. It's you just say different things and you hear it differently, and you're just automatically more empathic because you're not trying to change it or fix it, or you don't feel guilty about it in the same way that you might otherwise. And so it does free you up a little bit to help them feel less alone, which is really one of their biggest challenges, is that they feel alone.
And some of the minefields, and one in particular, you called it the "but sweetie" minefield, and I hear it, and I hear it in others, and quite frankly, I've also heard it out of my own mouth. Say, for instance, your child feels ugly or stupid, and you go to them and you say, "Oh, but sweetie, you're gorgeous. Can't you see that?" Or if your child is expressing something that would indicate that they don't feel appreciated or loved. "Oh, but sweetie, there are so many people who love you." Or if you're dumb, "But sweetie, your teachers, you're so smart. If you would just try harder," that blah, blah, blah. Why is that? I know why we as parents do it. We want our children to realize that they're beautiful, smart, and loved. But why is that not an effective way to go about having them feel that way?
Well, it's funny, it really does make them feel more alone, and because they feel more alone, they feel more lost and misunderstood, and they definitely feel more disconnected from their parents. And they also feel guilty because they're now sort of sensing that their parents are not really tolerating, their darker, sort of less attractive or less positive feelings. And they're also feeling kind of inadequate because they feel like, why can everyone else see something that I cannot seem to get to? It seems so easy for everyone else to love me. Why is it so hard for me? Which makes them feel even more alone and even more sort of damaged and just, like there's something wrong with them.
So how should a parent, if your child is coming to you, your teen is coming to you and saying in so many words that they feel ugly or stupid, what is an empathetic response from a parent?
And I just want to say too, even though this may go without saying, but when we're in the throes of parenting, sometimes it's helpful to say it anyway. That when we do truly empathize with them, it does relieve a burden for them, and you actually can start moving forward from there, which is interesting because that's not the way that we would maybe assume that it would go. But as soon as you're able to be with them and they feel like they have a witness, they feel less alone, then they're able to start to feel empowered and start to be able to take steps on their own to kind of change the way they view themselves and change the way they think about their life. But so there are a few things that I sometimes use just in my sessions too, but also just in real life, I guess. That one is that you add on to whatever they're saying. So if they say, I just feel like everyone else is prettier than I am. And you say, yeah, and that must be really hard. And that's really hard because you wish that you looked like them or something. And so if you can successfully sort of somewhat accurately, add on to what they're saying, then they feel less alone. So there's that piece. And then another way to add into what they're saying as opposed to putting our 2 cents in or our encouragement or reassurance or what have you in is to add and why wouldn't you feel that? Because, there are very few Asians around or there are very few this and, to try to provide kind of a context and validation of that they're not crazy for feeling that way. That, of course, it's totally understandable that they would feel that way given the blah, 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 and then, it really goes a long way.
Another minefield you talk about is the kind of "we will love you and will never abandon you" minefield. And you quote an adoptee saying, "If my mom tells me she loves me one more time, I think I'm going to scream," or whatever. And Okay, that's a hard one because as parents, and particularly as adoptive parents, we do want our kids to know that our love is forever and that we will never abandon them. So why does this one backfire?
Well, I think adopted teens worry that their parent is struggling with the separation, which there may be some truth to that. And so given that they are so highly attuned to their parents, they can sense all of those things in Technicolor. So they just are very aware of every single thing their parents are feeling, which is unfortunate in some ways for the parents.
Yeah.
You don't have anywhere to hide. But yeah, I think they're aware that the parent is struggling with the separation, and so then they feel really conflicted about what they're trying to do. Because part of separation sometimes includes pushing away and sometimes rejection. And so they don't really know. They're just sort of betwixt and between as to how to separate without hurting their parents.
So yeah, but why specifically for the conversation of "we love you and won't abandon you"? Is it because it doesn't? If it was really there, if those feelings were really there, they wouldn't need to be stated so often. Is that part of the issue, or why does that become an annoyance?
And I'm thinking specifically about, Well, what I was thinking about was when parents say "I love you" or something before they have give a consequence.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like you're grounded. I love you, but you're grounded. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And
yeah.
It there are just so many nuanced things. It weakens the parent's authority. Mm-hmm. It reveals the parent's insecurity that they're doing the wrong thing. So it does tell the teen that they're ambivalent and they're scared of the teen, which is also not what the teen wants. The teen wants to feel like their parent can handle them no matter what, and is really kind of the authority in the matter. So mm-hmm. it does reveal a lot about the parents, and mm-hmm. and it reveals that the parents may feel just anxious about the connection and the attachment, which I think can feel like a burden for the teen.
Mm-hmm. So the last of the skills that we as adoptive parents need to have is to help our children envision a future. Why is this important for adopted kids in particular? Obviously, it's important for all human beings to realize that there is a future for them. But why, in specific, did you select this as one of the top things for adoptive parents to develop?
Well, it's interesting. As I've worked with adopted teens, one of the topics is, of course, the future. But whenever I would ask adopted teens, they would have this certain dazed look, and it wasn't just dazed as in I don't really care, I can't think about this right now. It really was more dazed as in I just dissociate. They're almost not even able to stay in the room when we talk about the future. And so I found myself really thinking about, what are they up against in terms of trying to see their future. Given that the past is so hazy, it also makes it feel like the future is very hazy. And so they really do feel like they're sort of walking in the dark because they don't have the reference points that biological kids have. And so they don't have a sense of what they're going to look like when they get older, what their strengths could be when they get older. And I know this from having biological kids now. There is a lot of overlap. There is a strong genetic component to, certain propensities and weaknesses and things. And so they're definitely, you can sort of see the thread of, what's going on, and you can see what something might look like when you get older, because you can see, oh, okay, that's how my mom is dealing with it, so then now I can blah, blah, But adoptees don't have that. And so they mm-hmm. really are walking literally into the dark, and that is really terrifying for them. They have no idea. They're completely starting from scratch.
Yeah. And so they need us as parents to do what? How do we help them envision what their future would be?
So there are a couple of ways, and what I describe it in the book as is strength and style, that they likely have strengths that the adoptive parent doesn't have, and those are really worth mentioning, not so much as a compliment or support, because again we know that can go either way, but more just as information that they really need that they don't necessarily have. And I think, with style, I think that has to do more with personality and giving them kind of feedback or input about their personality. Like, oh, okay, you're someone who doesn't want to sit still, so you would never want to sit still in an office. And to really start to speak literally, to put words to speculating out loud about their future, about, oh, okay, could you ever see yourself doing, this certain thing? Is that something you could see yourself? What would you like about that? To kind of, to start to sort of shine a flashlight into the situation.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. You have a section in the book that I absolutely loved. It was the chapter on race, and particularly as an Asian transracial adoptee. It was very insightful, and we won't have time to talk about it in detail in this interview, but I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on the transracial experience, and of course you're coming from an Asian as an Asian transracial adoptee, and you made some notes as to how it's different from the black transracial adoption experience. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that race is really hard to talk about, and because there are so many minefields associated with race. But because my particular personal experience had to do with growing up in a pretty diverse Chicago community, and then also an almost all black high school, it was something that I really thought about a lot. And I think that the black experience and the Asian experience are somewhat different because of the stereotypes that are associated with each experience. And so, anyway, I mean, I don't know if we need to get into the specific stereotypes, but
well, you can. We could go, just a bit. We won't go into it in depth. I recommend this chapter in the book, but I thought that was I think it's spot on, and I think it is different. So some of the stereotypes for Asians tend to be more what we would consider positive stereotypes.
Right, the whole model minority, and then
right.
Asians as a minority sometimes feel like the teacher's pet of minorities, which is not enjoyable. That doesn't really usually work well for most teachers' pets. And then to be compared to kind of be used as benchmarks for other minorities, I think just sort of compounds the issue.
Right.
But I use the example in the book about my clinician friends and I were talking about. Just our experience with clients and stuff, and two of them were African American, the three of us were talking, and they were talking about how every time they see a parent, the parent goes through this sort of extensive explanation of how to handle their child, which I thought was really interesting given that I was a newer clinician and I never had a parent give me instructions on how to handle their child in a session. And these two clinicians whom I worked with were extremely experienced and senior clinicians, and so I just found it intriguing and wondered how much race, I guess that was my bias, that race played a pretty kind of significant issue in that, linked to the stereotype about intelligence, or the kind of extreme difference in culture in the black community compared to the white community. Just that perception, at least, yeah.
So for a transracial adoptive parent whose child is in their teen years, what are one or two things you would want them to know about how race and how their attitude towards race will impact their teenager?
I think that one of the big things about the teen years is the kind of obsession about one's appearance. And so because there's all this focus on one's appearance, and because there's so much focus on belonging, fitting in, it can really kind of heighten the whole wanting to fit in piece. And there just can be a lot of self-loathing about it. And the fitting in is a survival adaptation. It's an understandable response to feeling alone and feeling kind of exposed or feeling different or feeling kind of marginalized in some way. But I think there can be a lot of emphasis on one's appearance. And so I think that adoptive parents, it does help if they're ready for that, even if it hadn't come up in the past.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah. great words of wisdom. Thank you so much, Katie Naftzger, for being on Creating Family and being interviewed today for this. You are the author of the book, Parenting in the Eye of the Storm, The Adoptive Parent's Guide to Navigating the Teen Years. Keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how to apply it to your specific situation, please work with your adoption professional. If you have enjoyed this show, if you want to help us help it grow, please give us a rating on iTunes. It is very helpful. It helps us. It is what iTunes uses as their how they recommend shows, and it would be a tremendous help to us. Katie, if people want to reach you by website, do you have one?
I do. It's www.adoptiontherapyma.com.
All right, adoptiontherapyma.com. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
And now, an ad from Dad.
All right, save money on car insurance when you bundle home and auto with Progressive. Can I take these off? All right. What is this? This looks good. Wow, that's well made. Where did you get this? I'm talking to you with the hair. Yeah, where did you get this? It's good stuff. That's solid. That's not veneer. That's solid stuff.
Progressive can't save you from becoming your parents, but we can save you money when you bundle home and auto. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discounts not available in all states or situations. Let's say you just bought a house. Bad news is, you're one step closer to becoming your parents. You'll proudly mow the lawn. Ask if anybody noticed you mowed the lawn. Tell people to stay off the lawn. Compare it to your neighbor's lawn. And complain about having to mow the lawn again. Good news is, it's easy to bundle home and auto through Progressive and save on your car insurance, which, of course, will go right into the lawn. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations.